How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Euler Gonzalez here, and today let's go to now make a quick recap of Vue 3 fundamentals as a way to first look at this particular course taught by Ben Hahn while we are improving our soft skills to understand now what is the problem that now Vue 3 actually solves, what is the inner mechanism, the JavaScript mechanism that is using behind the scenes, so for example like proxy, okay, and what are now is the concepts, directives, the mental model around Vue 3. So then we can look now at what are the use cases we can go with it, as well as a practical example of that. So let's get it started, right? So this is a course taught by Ben Hahn, which is back then a senior staff developer experience engineer at Netflix, at Netlify, a Vue.js core team member, Knox ambassador, UX master instructor, and also Google expert in web technology. And here the approach or the workshop is to apply this thing, this framework that he made, which is learn, question, and apply. Okay, so you're gonna learn things, you're going to now ask a couple of questions, and then we're gonna see now real life examples. So here are the requisites for this, right? That you must know is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Be familiar with terminal as well as Git. So this is the workshop formats, right? Learn, explain, explanation and examples, questions, clarification in what if, and then the work, apply, exercise, and play and experiment. So we're going to look at this three main topic in this hour and a half, and to quickly recap that. So a little bit of history from how do we get here, right? So as a way to understand Vue, we need to understand how do we get here. So once we truly get it, we'll embrace the complexity based on your needs. So I just want to listen a little bit of his story about that. No, okay. There you go.
So, story time. When I first started getting
Story time. Exactly. First story time. No. Which is the story time. Story time.
one of those people who thought that JavaScript, well, in order to know JavaScript, you need to learn Java. And this was back in the day where I was learning from an O'Reilly book. I picked up like an HTML book that my dad had kind of left around. And then so when I saw the JavaScript, I was like, I picked up the Java book instead, and then I got really confused, and then I gave up, and I was discouraged for many, many years. But then when I started getting back into it, then I started learning, oh, okay, so it's different. And I started working with jQuery, and then around this time frame, which started to become really big. So of course, Angular at this point had really started to get really popular at that point. And then React came on the scene. And so at this point, I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to get my skills up to date? And so I had kind of worked with all of these, and React was the one I'd really been pushing for at one of my old jobs when I really first started getting hands-on experience with frameworks. Because after all, this was, at least as far as the statistics show, the most popular one, and it gave me a lot of opportunities to practice JavaScript, so why not? But what's interesting is that at this company, even though I was pushing for React, I had my team going, well, there's this new kid on the block called Vue, and this is around the time Vue 2 came out. We should really check this out. It's supposed to be basically just as performant as React, and it has a more approachable way of building apps. And for me, I was like, I want to learn the most popular thing, right? The most cutting edge. So I was incredibly resistant to it. And so part of the reason I tell this story is because I want you to know that this is where I came from, as far as like experience working with all these different frameworks, and then from this context of
okay, but this is his experience. Okay. Okay, it's just describing his experience. jQuery, Angular,
okay,
and
so
React.
Just to make sure we clarify the simple definition of what Vue is, I think the simplest way
It's a reactivity system.
JavaScript framework for building web user interfaces. That's basically what it is. It can certainly be used to power other things. You know, now that we have frameworks that can help you build mobile apps, you You can certainly use it underlying, but primarily it's used to build web interfaces.
Again, there is a difference between, and here this is pretty much like where now these things diverge. So Vue, unlike React, so React is now a library. Okay, it's not a framework. It's a library that allows to create user interface, small user interface. So by wrapping those HTML elements with some sort of functionalities around it, which is the React library, now we can compose user interface, okay, to build websites. So with Vue, this is a JavaScript framework, a way to do things, a way to build now JavaScript, use a way to build web interface, web user interface, that unlike React, especially this is something true for managing the state of your applications here and there, okay, that at some point the challenge that React presents is that you need to keep track of all of this state that you need to handle, right? So you have now your local state change, and then you have the application level stage. So the thing is that because you need to know and care and keep track of when a state change. And why is that? Because otherwise it will re-render the entire application from that point and all of the elements below to that. So Vue says, okay, let me now be a framework, a way to do this that allows to keep track is the state of your applications. So this is why Vue is called as reactivity system, right? And this is when the concept of state on Vue, on React 18, and how now this different states, when you update a particular state, is going to cast now a cascade effect due to the nature of how React actually works, which is the trigger, render, and the trigger render, the trigger to detect when the state change happens, the trigger, the render, and the trigger, the render, so right now I'm quickly is overview this. Let me actually show you so you can look at this. And can you look at that? There you got it. Okay. Is this right? Is the React render and commit. So it actually, this is the workflow of what's going on when a React component updates, or when you or the user update a state in a user interface, right? It passes through the trigger, the render, and the commit. Okay, and the commit phase when all of those changes now are being applied. So this particular workflow, which is something that you have to be aware of this, but the thing here is that despite that React is using, for example, a lot of this JavaScript concepts like closure and scope, and memoization and all that kind of stuff, which is now JavaScript technologies and patterns, right? The thing here is that you have to be aware of when that happens, so you don't cause now a cascade effects of re-rendering components. Where now with the Vue proposition, you say, hey, I'm gonna keep track all of those state changes for you and only update the components that are relevant for that. Let me actually, in fact, ask Claude about it, right? Say Claude here. There you got it. So it is safe to say that it is safe to say that the reactivity system from Vue is or says, let me tracking all let me tracking let me track uh, when an state change, and then update only the component that are affected. Right? So just to put it simple words. Yeah, that's exactly right. Vue reactivity systems build around the precise dependency tracking. When you modify a reactive state, which is something that I'm not quite familiar, we're going to see that later on, Vue know exactly which components, computer property, or watchers depend on that specific piece of data. So it only re-renders or updates those affected parts rather than doing a broad re-rendering. This is different from some other approach when you might re-render entire components tree or use manual optimization technique. Vue reactivity systems use JavaScript proxies, at least in Vue 3, or getter and setter interceptions in Vue 2 to automatically track dependency during execution, creating a dependency graph. This is when we need to look at graph, okay, that maps state to consumers. So when you change the username, for example, Vue doesn't need to check every component, exactly. It already knows which components reference user.name during their last render and update only those. It makes Vue updates very efficient and helps avoid unnecessary works. So unlike the React applications, okay, so unlike the React applications, when a user change the state, or when a state change happen, it will cause a ripple effect of re-rendering components below in re-rendering child components. So like React application, when the state change happen, it will cause a ripple effect of re-rendering child components. Vue, on the other hand, it just update the proper component, and those components, okay, so Vue on the other hand is just update the component, and those it's gonna update the component that cause a change state, and those that are relevant, and those that depend on that via computer properties or watchers. So you have captured the key architecture difference between the two frameworks. In React, when a state change in a parent component, it triggers a re-render cascade down the component tree by default. So all childs re-render unless you explicitly optimize to say, hey, no, I don't want you to re-render, right? So for example, with React Memo, or use Memo or use callback, or similar techniques. This is a React's re-rendering by default philosophy. It assumes re-rendering is cheap, and puts the optimization burden on the developer. Vue takes the opposite approach, which is a fine-grained reactivity. So when the user name change, Vue doesn't care about the components hierarchy at all. It only updates components that directly reference user.names and their templates. Computer property that depends on username. Watch observing that reactive system or that reactive state in any component that depends on those computer properties. So you could have a deeply nest child component that use username, and when it changes, Vue will update a specific child component directly, even if none of the parent component in betweens need to re-render. The component tree structure doesn't dictate the update patterns. This makes Vue updates more surgically and often require less manual optimization work, while React gives you more explicit control over the rendering process, but require more thought about when and how the components should update it. Can you draw a graph? Can you? I want to have an illustration between both, so I can deeply understand them and have a mental model of them. Mm-hmm. Where now Vue say dependency tracking, surgical update, and all that kind of stuff. Exactly, top-down re-rendering and all child re-rendering by default, and require manual optimizations to do that. And those manual optimizations are use Memo or use callback. Where now here, you don't need this kind of manual optimizations, because they're already going to keep track is when this component, so when this reactive reference is being used, which component is wrote. You can think of this that behind the scene is now some sort of hash, right? We're going to store all of that. So how can we take a look at that, right? Well, let's go to go to the view and say GitHub here. This is view. There you got it. And create view. That's right. This is to create a component. What about the core here? And the package. So the package like view core compiler reactivity view the source. Yeah, the source, but I think this is for the entry is the full build that includes. Oh, but this is for the field build. Now, what about the compiler code SFC servers are rendering reactivity? That's right. View reactivity. This package is inline into global and browser is built, but also published as the package that can be used as a standalone. The credit to implementing is inspired prior to JavaScript ecosystem, Meteor Tracker, NGS Observer Util, and Salesforce Observable Membrane. Interesting. There you go. That's exactly what I was looking for. Reactive and ref. So ref is used, as you can see, get on set. And as you can see, what is this? This is a record. This is a record, right? And they say you have now the value get and set, all right? But you're going to accept type differentiator only. We need this to be in public.ts, but I want it to show in the ID autocomplete, so we use private symbol instead. Check if a value is a ref object, right? The value to inspect and expose, and as you can see, export a function that is called isRef. The interface called ref, right? And export the function now called ref. It takes a value, any value, right? That is going to now is make that value, right? A derive or to extend, okay, from the ref interface. In other words, what we're doing is to wrapping this value that we're receiving with this additional information. That's exactly what we're doing. That's what we're doing. In this additional information is this, the get and set, right? So if any, if the T and T, it is, so ref, unwrap ref, or unwrap ref. Okay. So if that exists, right? If any, you want to have is now the type with this, or the simple T, right? Or you want to say, hey, the reference will be now an unwrap ref, which is something that they don't have here, but I think this is part of the utility they have. Must be imported here. Anyway, in the unwrap ref, like this. And here's when they export this function. So export ref function here, export function ref like this. All of these are signatures. Takes an inner value and returns a reactive, immutable ref object, which has a single property dot value that points to the inner here. And as you can see, it is ref, ref, or ref. It calls now this function called create ref as a way to create this reference. And create reference, what it does is to see is that, hey, if this is a reactive value, you have now a reference, so return the raw value. If it's not, let me create now this ref implementation. And here's where the things get interesting here. It receives now the raw value and the shallow property, which is a boolean, okay? and they say that this is a boolean here, shallow version of link ref, where they say reactivity advanced shallow ref, inner value of the shallow ref. This is, you want to go and dive deep into that. So let's get into this. So shallow version ref, it means that one level, right? Unlike ref, the inner value of a shallow ref is stored as expose is and will not be made deeply reactive. Exactly. So very interesting topic here when you use a ref, because it is by default a deeply nested reactive objects, or in other words, what it's doing is to keep track of all of this. So this ref, you can see, is going to now keep track. So that value that you have is going to now append that property, the value they get in the setters for all of those levels, right? So you say, hey, I just want to make a shallow ref to actually keep track of this state at the most top level of this object. I don't care about the nested objects. I just only care about this. And when any one of them change, I want you to notify that, and therefore render that. So here we are in the create ref, right? New ref implementation, where we pass now the raw value. That's interesting, because with the use ref, you can see ref here, we only get the value. Interesting. The value that can be unknown, but we will know that at runtime, or when we define that. Shallow ref, you can see, and the implementation here, that is say, hey, this ref is a class that has now a private method called value and another private method called raw value. So this is, okay, both of them are private. It has now something called as deep, the dependency, okay? And if you take a look at the dependency that comes from here, dependency. So now dependency, this is export class. There you get it, dep, which is an object. Let's say you have a version, active link, subhead, map, key for object property depth cleanup, right? Key to map. This is where now everything makes sense. So you create now a map here, and a key, and a constructor that say, hey, subhead, which is a type of link. Double link representing the subscribing effect. Holy hell, bro. Def only for invoking on trigger hook in correct order. Holy moly. They're using now is a linked list for that. Link between this dep and the current active effect. Oh, that's interesting. So they create now a reference for that. Link between this dep, this dependency, and the current active effect. Interesting. To track, all right, where it's going to return now a link, and here's when it's going to say, hey, I'm going to create now a new link for that. Otherwise, reuse the last run already sub, just sync the version. That's interesting. The trigger, the notify, add sublink, the main weak map that store target key and depth, and the connections. But again, it all ends here. So you have now map key constructor track, trigger, notify, star batch, try if def, link.sub notify, finally end batch, and then notify. Okay, so based on so it create now that when this depth at the end of the day is now before each effect runs, all previous deep links version of reset to -1 during the round, a link version is synced with the source depth on access after round link. A double link lane representing the subscribing effects head and def only for invoking on trigger hooks incorrect only. And here's now track access to the reactive property. This will check which effect is running, and at the moment of the record is at depth, which record all effects that depend on the reactive property. So in other words, this function target objects type and key should track and depth map here from the target map. And the target map is a cons here, which is a hash table. You know, it's a hash table. The main weak map that store the key, that store target, key, and depths. Okay, target, key, and depth. Connections. Conceptually, it is easy to think of the dependency as a depth class, which maintains a set of subscribers, but we simply store them as the raw maps to reduce memory overheat. Exactly, for memory overheat, we use raw maps, where we simply store them and maintain a set of subscribers. Okay, it is easy to think of a dependency of a depth class. But exactly, conceptually, it is easy to think of a dependency as a depth class. Okay, the main weak map that store connections. Conceptually, it is easy to think of a dependency as a depth class, which maintain a set of subscribers. So you have now the dependency class that maintain a set of subscribers to this. Track access to a reactivity property, and this will check which effect is running at the moment and record it as depth. This will check which effect is running at the moment and record it as depth. And then you get this, find all the depth associated with the target or the specific property and triggers the effect stored within. So it is using behind the scenes a weak map to track dependencies. So it is using behind the scenes a weak map to track dependencies. Not exactly a weak map for dependency tracking though. Vue does use a weak map in some part of its reactivity system. Let me break down what Vue actually uses. Proxy and the target map. Vue uses JavaScript proxy to intercept property access on reactive objects. Okay. When you access to the username, the proxy gets trapped files and records the dependency. The weak map, the dependency tracking structure, target map, target object, and depth maps. So property key and depth set. So you have now a weak map of the target map that has now the target object or the map, the dependency map, and the property key and depth at the set of the effects. The weak map part Vue does use weak map called target map to map originally objects to their dependency maps. To their dependency maps. Okay, I'm going to map this object to these dependency maps. Okay. So this prevent memory leaks since weak map allow garbage collections of the key. Exactly. So if this object now is no longer being used, okay, please clean this up. Okay, but it's using that. So the key here of this weak map or target map is to map the original object to their dependency map. And this prevents memory leaks since weak map allows garbage collection. So the actual dependency tracking. So these the dependency themselves are stored in a regular map and sets. So you have now the map string and the set reactive effect for each object. Each property key maps to set of effects, components, computer property, and watchers. So how it works, the header component render and access user.name, Vue records header, render effects depend on username. When user.name change, Vue lookup of the property dependency, which is the target object, the property dependency set and triggers all the effect in it. Only header, avatar, profile, and copyright that are in the set, so only they update them. So while a weak map are part of the system for memory management, the actual dependency tracking use maps and sets. The graph I mentioned earlier is really this nested map set structure that connects data property to the components computed that depends on them. So this is much more granular than React component tree based approach. It's okay if you don't get that at once, but the TLDR of this is that the proxy and the target map. So Vue wrap these objects, all right, as a way to detect changes on that. And when those changes happen, right, it has now that object as the key and their values as the dependency map. So Vue wrap an object. Okay, so Vue wrap an object. So Vue wrap an object in a proxy to detect change on that in a target map or a weak map. In a target map or a weak map, okay, and a target map or a weak map to know which object, exactly, which object has a set of dependencies. The dependency map. The dependency map. So if you wrap an object, so you pass now this object, this data, this value. You pass now this value to Vue in a ref. And React and Vue say, hey, let me now take this. I'm going to wrap into a proxy so I can detect when a state change happen. And when that happened, I want to now keep track of that using a hash table or a weak map for memory efficient, or to be, so key are garbage collected. In other words, when that key is no longer being used, I have now more space in memory, okay? That is going to map the dependency, the set of dependency here. Exactly. View reactivity mechanism is that proxy wrapper when you make an object, when you make a reactive object, which is whether it's a ref or a reactive, etc., Vue wraps into a proxy to intercept all property access and mutations. Target map, this is the master registry. So the target map, you can think of this as the ledger, okay? So you can think of the master registry, okay? Okay, the master registry. So this is the master registry, and that map each original object to its dependency information. And deep maps for each track objects and to dependency map. And for these track objects, this map connects property key to its dependency. So property key to the set of reactive effects. And it's going to run all of that. So yes, the proxy detects the change access, and then the target map keep tracks of who cares about what. The weak map is crucial because it allows the original object to be garbage collected when no longer referenced elsewhere, preventing memory leaks. This elegant design gives Vue its automatic reactivity. Developer just mutate data normally, and Vue's proxy plus target map system handles all the dependency tracking and updates behind the scenes. This is where the magic happens. Oh my God, interesting. Okay, so when you create now a reactive object, whether it is a ref or a reactive, right? You pass that value or that object. So if you now wrap that into a proxy that allows you to detect now property change on that object, and it create now this master registry, okay, known as the target map, which is a weak map that say the key, and it does that for memory optimization. Why is that? Because weak map now, when there is no reference of their key, is going to be eligible for the garbage collector. In other words, you will have more space when somebody doesn't, or when your application doesn't need that object or that data, right? So this weak map now what it does is to keep track is that object, okay, the original object, and it is map dependency or the table of dependency, where that table or that map says I'm going to now is keep track the property and a set of effective or a set of effects that are registered to this. Okay. What will be reactive effect? That automatically reruns when a reactive dependency change. When a reactive dependency change. So reactive effect is a subscriber in the view pub sub system. They subscribe to reactive data and get notified when it changes. Except in the target map structure, you have the target map, which is a weak map that has the user objects that has a map from the property name and the set or the reactive effects. Header render effects, avatar, okay. So it is safe to say that the reactive effects in the maps of dependencies, right? So it is safe to say that the reactive effect in the maps of dependencies store the. Let me in fact look at that reactive dependency. Store which components use that property. Which render functions, computer function, or watcher function use that property. So it is safe to say that the reactive effect is the reactive effect in the maps of dependencies store in the map of dependencies from the weak map, from the target map, aka the weak map. Okay, so it is safe to say that the reactive effects in the maps of dependency from the target map, the weak map, store which functions, store which render function, computed functions, and watchers use that property. So internally is using that. Holy moly. So internally is using that. This is why view reactivity is so efficient. It knows exactly which functions needs to run for each property change. It knows exactly which property where I can look at this piece of code specifically. The effects the reactivity package where we are, the effects key file to study contains the reactive effects class and dependency tracking logic. Contains the reactive effects class and dependency tracking logic. Contains the reactive function and proxy creation. Base handler contains a proxy get set handlers that do actual tracking. And the depth. Holy moly. All right. So that's mind blowing. It contains the dependency management, the set in or target. Okay. Depth ref. We have that. The ref or reactive. Object array map set weak map and set target type map, and then reactive returns a reactive project of an object. The reactive conversion is deep. It affects all nested properties. A reactive object is also deeply unwrapped. Create reactive objects, and these create reactive objects, as you can see here, let me take a look at the function. It say, hey, I'm going to receive this and I'm going to return you as the target. Okay, value cannot be made, target, target is already a proxy. Return it. Exception call read only. Is there only specific value type can be observed? Exactly. Only specific value type can be observed. And those specific values that can be observed are on the reactive flag, which is the enum here. Is reactive, is read only, is shallow. Target to type. Exactly. And this is the only object that can be observed. Whether it is an object, an array, a map, and it's returned that as a target type common. A map, a set, a weak map, a weak set. Target that can be now converted, that can be observed. Creating reactive objects. Well, exactly. It is objects, arrays, weak map. It is objects, arrays, and iterables like map and set. Weak map in weak set. Interesting. So it creates that, right? And it say, hey, this is the objects that I can create from you. Okay. I can now create reactive raw. I can now get target type. All right. Get target type to identify what are the objects that I can wrap here. Target already has corresponding proxy and existing proxy, or create a new proxy with that, where the target is this and the target type is going to check that. Collections handler and base handlers. These base handlers, mutable handlers, read-only handlers, shallow reactive handlers, and this base handlers. And base handlers. And base handlers. So base handlers are exported like this. Base handlers. Base reactive handler implements proxy handler. You get the get, mutable reactive handlers on the set, delete property has, because it comes from the base reactive handler, and base reactive handler implements the proxy handler target. And the proxy handler target, all right, and the proxy handler on JavaScript the proxy handlers like this, the proxy handlers is the type of this. Proxies are often used with reflex object, which provides some of the method with the same name as the proxy traps. The reflect method provides the reflective semantics for invoking the corresponding object internal methods. Corresponding object internal methods. Exactly. Corresponding object internal methods. The corresponding trap, which is has, get, set, delete property, owns key, define property, and all of this. And in our case, they're only using is for that. Set delete property has unknown keys. You know, they are only using is this. Base reactive handler. So one of them is for mutable reactive handler, read only handler, it's all of this trap, bro. Holy moly. Holy moly, bro. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, holy moly, bro. So I know the core of this and what it's doing behind the scene, especially when you define a reactive property, at least in view 3, all right, that what it's doing is to wrap that object into a proxy and store that into a weak map or the target map, where the weak map is for memory, for being memory efficient, which is a key aspect here, that put the responsibility on the garbage collector, which is a feature from JavaScript, to say when you don't have a reference, or when an object is not being used anymore in memory, please discard that element, right? Make it this space available, right? So on that, all right, we're using is this weak map to say, hey, this object, the original objects, all right, I'm going to now map that to the dependencies, to the reactive effects dependency, and this reactive effects dependencies, which store is now render functions, computer functions, and watchers that use that property. then use that property. So the question here is that it stores that and then it triggers that. So how does it know? So how does it know? So how does it know which computed functions, watchers, and renders and render functions? How does it know which computer functions, watches, and render functions are attached to that property? Anytime we use a computed watcher function, or we declare a reactive property on a render function, if you know which functions are attached to properly through dynamic dependency tracking during execution, here's exactly how it works. Dynamic dependency tracking during execution. View use global variables called active effects or active sub in View 3.5 to track which function is currently running. Simplified version of what View does internally. Active effects, and it's a function tracks the target on the key if the active effects which record the active effect dependency on the target key. I'm going to now get that as a dependency map, and if I don't have anything, okay, then I want to now set that to be the new map of this. Otherwise, I know that I have the dependency here, and then we're going to set that and add the active effect. This is the magic, the execution flow. When reactive data is accessed like this, when a computer property is created, it's because it's adding that effect. It's because it's storing that. It's because it's storing the active effects here, all right? And it's going to check that active effects. So anytime that you call the track here, and simplified version of what View does internally, and the active effects record that active effects depends on the target key. The key inside View doesn't know ahead of time which functions depend on which property. Instead, it discovers dependency dynamically by setting an active effects before running any reactive functions, recording the active effect whenever reactive data is accessed, building the dependency graph through actual execution. This is why View reactivity system just work, because it set an active effects before running any reactive function, recording the active effects whenever reactive data is accessed, building the dependency graph through actual execution. This is why reactivity just works. It tracks dependency by watching what your code actually does, not by analyzing what it might do. That it does at runtime. Okay. So we know behind the scenes what it's doing when we use ref and reactive or computed watchers or render functions. Okay. So. Okay. So that'll be all for this video. I'm gonna make a quick pause here. Take care. Bye bye. And we are back. Oh, give me a second. And now we're back. So what we're gonna do is after I went through understanding now what the React view is all about, right? This reactivity system that at the end of the day, unlike now React or Angular, especially React, which is focused on how you can build is this user interface. Now in Vue, this is a reactive rendering system. So in other words, now instead of you having to define all of this single user interface or small user interface, right? So you can now define is user interface that are going to now keep track when they need to be updated, when they need to be re-rendered, right? Based on when a reactive reference trigger or a computed or a watcher or a render function triggers by a reactive reference. So in other words, so this is Vue. It's talk about is why we choose to go with Vue. Because it is approachable, since unlike now React, which use ES6 as a way to extend now the way of how we can build is our user interface, because without it we need to rely is on React create elements anytime that we need to create is a user interface. So that's the reason why we have now ES6, right? And it was developed by PHP developers in a PHP flag in a PHP flavor called hack, right? As a way to let now this particular components or aka HTML tag be rendered with this additional functionality for small user interface. It is also performance, because since this is now a reactive compiler optimized rendering system, and as I mentioned before, that unlike React, where all of by default React re-renders the entire user interface, okay, here is just only going to keep track when the state needs. It's going to keep track the state change, all right, and only rendering those where it only render those components, those user interface that cause a change in a dependency chain, in a dependency tree. So in other words, unlike React, where it's going to render the entire tree, unlike you explicitly and manually say, hey, I don't want you to render this use Mimo or use callback or Mimo, right? By default, now Vue says, hey, I'm just only going to render when a state change or if that particular state depends on another, right? So that's very, very interesting. A different approach when it comes to write our applications, and because this has a lot of influence from React and also from Angular, because the creator of Vue is work at AngularJS, Evan Yu, right? So this is the value proposition of Vue, right? So technically speaking, Vue is a data event driven HTML interpolator. That sounds a lot of fancy words, but what it means is that it will update the UI with the latest change. But it's going to update that particular UI with the latest change. So you can focus on building your business. So instead of tracking and keep up to date different UI states and data. This is one of the value proposition of Vue solve, right? So with Vue, we can now not only focus on building is static page or enhanced embedding web applications or web apps like single page applications, server-side rendering, or generating static generation site, or even target the desktop, mobile, and WebLG, and even the terminal. Now, good, because so far, okay, we have looked at, there's a couple use cases for that. Let me see if this still being applied to. For example, developers Apple tutorials. Let me see if that still works. So developers Apple tutorials. I mean, it's tutorial Swift. I don't think exactly. So they get rid of that. Swift UI. Let's say Swift UI, or just like that. Swift UI. All right. It seems like they ditched that. That's interesting. Yep, it seems like they ditched that. Swift UI. Yeah, it seems like they ditched Vue. Careersgoogle.com. Careersgoogle.com. And you may wonder, how do you know that? Well, I have a widget that actually detects that. It seems that they rewrote that to say, hey, no, we're going to go only with JavaScript. Exactly. It's way much better. It's going to do this with only plain JavaScript. I love it. Ray.com. is using Vue for that. And they have a lot of stuff going on. Ray.shop is using Vue for that. Yep.
E-commerce goes, we have REI.
L'Oreal Paris in USA. So look at this. So L'Oreal Paris USA .com. When we check this, the using is now Vue. Okay, they commit to Vue. Interesting. They commit to Vue, and also with Hammer.js and Core.js. Optimally. And then you got it. Interesting. L'Oreal Paris.
This is before many would change the ink as well, so we were logging in.
My.Nintendo. My.Nintendo.com. It seems they using Vue. They ditched that. They ditched that. They say, hey, you know what? Let's go with simple JavaScript. Yeah. Let's go with simple JavaScript.
They are also using
MediaWiki. So MediaWiki. It's using Vue and PHP. So they stick with that.
And if you didn't know, MediaWiki, which is like the big organization behind like Wikipedia as well as some other properties, they actually did a really long investigation into deciding which framework they would adopt going forward for their basically migration. And basically, they landed on Vue, which was we were really happy to hear. And so if you're ever looking to see kind of why they did that, there's a whole paper on that. So I just wanted to alert you all if you're curious about like big organization migrating to Vue and their reasoning behind it. That is there for you all to read.
But it's interesting because there is a lot of company that actually opt in or opt out from Vue, and they say, hey, no, we prefer to go with full native JavaScript, right? So for example, Apple and Google. Interesting.
So the question here is what So what I'm going to do first is Vue app, the guide, review from the case study. And so to verify that this works, that something actually happened, we're actually going to go ahead and open up our browser console. And you'll notice here that one, it's already alerting us that we're running a development build of Vue. So in other words, if we're going to deploy this, we're going to need to use a production deployment because this is the size is turning a bit larger. But this is fine because we're learning right now. So the way you can check that also that this is working is if you type Vue, it'll autocomplete, and you'll notice it'll basically bring up the Vue object that's ready to be used. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and just show you basically how that kind of works. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a div, and just like you typically would expect, I'm going to call the div app. That's all we're going to do. And then we're going to say my app here, save it, refresh, there you go, my app is showing up here. And now let's go ahead and actually attach our app, and how do we do that? So what we're going to do now is we're going to open up a script block at the bottom, and we're actually going to go ahead and bring in a function from Vue called create app. So I'm going to create a
It's just going to create that.
It from Vue, so it's going to look like this.
The create app.
Now this is an alternative syntax of basically just calling create app like this.
Exactly.
Calling the function that way. But there'll be an advantage to this from like a syntax perspective, so that's why we're just structuring the function out. And all we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say const app equals create
app. With now.
And so what that'll do is it'll create a variable called app, and then it'll go ahead and create that app. And all we're going to do now is we're going to mount.
And let's go to now.
Because what we got to do, we got to tell Vue where it is we want to actually put the app. So that is where this mount keyword comes in. And we're going to mount it to the app.
I want to mount this here.
Using the CSS selector here, so that mounted directly into this. So in 3 lines of code, we have dropped Vue, or I guess 4 to include the CDN. We've loaded Vue onto the page, and we basically created that. So if we refresh it, we'll notice nothing's really happening. And that's totally fine because we haven't had Vue display anything. And so when it comes to frameworks, one of the things that people love about working with frameworks is that it really helps to track your data across different states. So that's called reactive data. So the fact that when something changes, it'll go ahead and make sure that your HTML page is updated as expected. So the way we're going to do this is inside of our create app, we're going to pass it an object.
Exactly. And here this object allows you to configure that, to define what is the reactive data for it.
And what we're going to do is this is going to be a function that returns an object. And so if we think about what's going on here, basically we're saying, hey, Vue would want you to create an app that's going to have a data property. And the reason we're using a function here is because we wanted to actually basically maintain the reactivity in terms of like tracking the latest instance of that object. Because if you were to do something instead, like just data like this, the data becomes stale over time and there becomes like caching issues. And so it's become kind of best practice across frameworks that when you're managing data, you actually have it be a function that returns an object, and then the framework will take care of it from there for you. And so in this, let's go ahead and just add a message here. And this time I'll just say hello, it works. Okay.
Right.
So now here we have our reactive data message, and the question is how are we
exactly reactive data message.
Well, the way we're going to do that is we're going to be using the curly brace syntax.
The curly braces, the double curly braces here. To say, hey, let's go to now render this.
As far as like the 3 frameworks are concerned, this one, Vue only type is message. That's all it is. When we refresh it, you'll notice your data is now appearing inside of your page.
So what it's doing behind the scene, and also it's quite interesting and important to at least recap those silly stuff that they're not that silly at all. And let's go with here, right? Can we make that? Can we make that? Can we go to the dashboard here and say, hey, I want to create now is a view. Can I create now a view sandbox, right? To say is playground. Okay. Well, now during the playground, what it does is to say, hey, it defines this. Okay. But what it does is to define that we import the model via here, via the npm, which is from package.json here, like Vite, TypeScript, and Vite.js plugin, followed by the view, right? But we can safely say, hey, I want to import this, and then right below, I want to now render this element as it is.
Just based on this, for those who have been working with web apps for a while, you might already start to realize there's a lot of flexibility with this. Because now all of a sudden, if you have a backend that's not quite ready to integrate all the build tools and everything you need to get it up and running, you can just on a specific page, when you're proposing to start progressively migrating your apps, you can say on this page, we're going to drop the CDN, and we're going to add the basically interactivity to this page, and over time, we'll migrate away, and then once we have enough pages that consolidate that view, then we can actually invest the time to do the build tools. Because I think a lot of times when we think about migration, a lot of times developers are thinking like, code freeze everything, no new features, and we just stop development. And we know that practically speaking, that just rarely works like this. And so this is a really great way for us to basically go ahead and migrate an enterprise app over to something like Vue.
I don't know, I just want to look at one way to import this, perhaps not with Code Sandbox, but the thing is, yeah, I think maybe with this. And it's interesting because it, despite that you load this from scratch, it comes with errors. You know, it comes with errors. It's like, okay. On the main app, which is the app here. And again, this is just plain view. This is all plain view, right? This is one of the reasons why I don't like to go with it. Let me actually hit here this and say view 3. And check this out to say view repositories here, socket. Let's render with view 3 tests. and then product detail for this. And then on the main app, this is where you're going to load that search bar and product list. And they use a store as a way to now fetch those data, like so. And here you are returning is this reactive reference product. Exactly, get product and search product as a function, where you are going to have access to them. Okay. Okay, makes sense. Makes sense. Next wrapping, while ago. And there's an old one. View assets, view sidebar, view 3 Pokédex, and then you go view sidebar, view 3. And the blog. Okay. 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 Cool. Cool. And now you got challenge here. Okay. All right. All right. All right. All right. All right. So in order to make this much web browser approach, let's go with this. Yeah, let's go with this, bro. Let's go with this. All right. And here we go with this. We don't have is the view 3. Okay. Anyway, okay. No problem. No problem. No problem. No problem. No problema, bro. No problema, bro. And let's go to open up here. There you got it. Right. And here let's going to create now a playground. So playground.html. That'll be is a doc type. That's right. But I need to be this doc type. I need to be this as an HTML5. Exactly, with the doc type. Why is that? Because, so you can see what I'm doing right now, is this. This cursor, go, there you go. Is this one. Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. So what I'm doing here is just from the scratch is to create, well, this small view applications. So this is useful, for example, if you are going to build, let's say, your PHP website or Python, that at some point you want to now is send this content and fetch data from the database and populate that into this template so you can now pack it up and send it back to the browser. So here we can, by using or by defining first, for example, stuff like this. All right. So in other words, we say, hey, this will be now an H1, right? An H1, and I'm going to define is now the H1, which is hello from Earth, right? Hello, Earthlings. Earthlings. I think I wrote this right. Earthlings, right? Good. So hello, Earthlings. I want to do a couple stuff. Here the title will be this. It will say view 3 fundamentals. right? And I want to say that the following. I want to mount this application here, okay, with an ID called app or root, as you like it, no problem. And I'm going to render something to say hello world. All right. And then I want to import the functionality, which is the JavaScript code. In other words, the JavaScript library. You say JavaScript library here. I mean view get started. I want to get is the CDN for that. No. Can I get the CDN version of it, not the build pipeline? There you go. Using the global build, right? We're using is this for distribution, or we can use is the ES6 model, right? Another way to use this, right, is also for enabling import maps. In the above example, we are importing the full CDN URL, but in the rest of the documentation, you will see code like this. What does it mean? We can teach the browser where to locate the view import by using import map. And let's go to go with this. So I can instruct, what I want to instruct is the browser here to where it's going to find is the view import. Okay. I would like to use is the development build. Let me see if I can go with this view global. I think it's this view global ESM. All right. So because, and that's quite interesting, because from the, let me actually do this, right? So we can do a couple stuff here. One of them is using view. Okay. You can say view with import, or view with ES6, all right, or view no ESs, ES6, all right. Or in other words, no ES models, because most, quite frankly, is this ES models. Okay, view with ES model, and the other is ES with no ES6. All right, and both of them works. So they with this thing here is that your browser must support that. So right now, this import map is something that is not widely supported for a lot of browsers. Okay, so right now it's roughly 93.70%. So I'm going to do this example for both of them, because I find that out quite important to do this. So HTML here. So what I'm going to say is with no EX model, I say this is not the view no ES model. All right. You say playground. View no ES model, right? And this works with this. We say, hey, let me use this div and say, first things first, I want to import this script, right? But I'm gonna do this. So hello, Erlins, right? I'm going to create now a div where I want to mount my application with something called app as an identifier. This will be the view app, right? Or you can say hello world. And then right below, I want to now import the script here. Give me the source with that. So that source is with this. Now this is from this one, right? Like this. So this is great because with this, now we can have access to this after you load that, and I can define another script here to say, hey, I want to have access to the view instance that you have here, and I want to destructure that method called create app. Okay, and then I want to now store is the instance of our view application in an account called app by saying create app. All right, and then mount that into our entry point or into our root elements here. In this case, you say map.mount. Exactly, map.mount map.mount here with the app, right? We need to pass the hash to indicate that this is the ES6 selector for that. All right, and if we want to now make this reactive data, okay, that any framework actually is using behind the scenes, so we can say, hey, I'm going to give you now an object where this object is initially something called data, that is a function that it will return now an object, in our case with the reactive data, which is the message, which so far so good. Okay, so here is slowly and progressively quite interesting because here you can say what up, hey, what's up. So if we go here and we open up, say revealing finder, and then I want to now drop this here, right? Hello world. Let me show you that here. Hello world, right? Quite straightforward. Hello world. However, if I want to now render that content, I can say something like this message. So by the time you reload this, I update this to what's up. This is with Vue.js with no ES model, and the other is with ES model, which is instructing the browser, hey, anytime that you look at this Vue import, this is the URL you want to fetch the data. All right, and then here we can say, hey, let's go to use this script. All right, and actually do the same. We need to instruct that this is a type model. All right, so it can detect the browser is the import and export syntax. We can say import syntax here from Vue. I think this is the way how you can do that. All right, from Vue. Exactly, from Vue. to do that. Give me a moment here. Exactly, from view. That's right. And here you can say, hey, get the create app. And the other is the ref. But let's going to keep things simple as it is. Where you say, I'm going to create now the app. And I want to hold that view instance here, where I'm going to pass now an object that is the data, aka or reactive data, and I'm going to have access via this return as an object here. You say message. You say what's up. Okay. And well, actually render this as it is, right? So this is a demo with view with ES models. All right, and the other is view no ES models. So view with ES model, and the other is view with no ES model. This is the subtle difference here. And after that, I want to mount this application into that element, which is the app. So let's take a look at that. So this is view no ES model, all right? And the other is, let me drop this, view with ES models. Again, both of them are rendering the same, but the logic is different, and it differs in terms of how now the browsers are looking for the JavaScript code that is hosted in somebody else's server or computer, and then fetch that and be able to have access to. I think this is quite interesting here. Very, very interesting here. And I'm going to create now this one. Yep. I'm going to create now this one. All right. Good. Get in it here. Let me actually define here at readme. So it's going to explore now topics like that. It's going to explore topics like reactivity fundamentals, computer property, class and style bindings, list rendering, event handling, form input bindings, watchers, and why watcher exists. Template ref, component basics, and lifecycle hooks. Okay, this is an overview, and the overview will be is is creating an application. Jesus. An application, exactly. So creating an application, template syntax, creating an application, ES6, ES model, or without it. Okay, template syntax, reactivity fundamentals, reactivity fundamentals, proxy, and the weak map, or it has a particular name. Mm-hmm. The no, this is not reactive, but this is the depth maps, the target map, proxy, and the target map, or the dependency maps. Exactly, the target maps. Exactly, proxy, target map, and dependency maps. Exactly. Proxy, target map, and depth maps. This is the reactivity fundamentals. Then you have now the computer property. Computer property, class and style bindings, class and style binding. Exactly, class and style bindings, conditional rendering, conditional rendering, list rendering, rendering, event handling, event handling, for inputs binding. And then you get now form inputs bindings, watchers, and template ref, which is how you can pick now particular elements here. And template ref, component basics, something that we are quite familiar with. How the data flow actually goes down to it, passing props. You see component basics and data flow, which is part of that, and then the life cycle hooks. And the life cycle. There you got it. Okay. Let's go to add now. I can ignore here. Okay. Okay. And now they don't say like that. They say, hey, let's going to use now is a reactive reference from that. You know, let's going to use is a reactive reference from that. Is on the setup, because now they have this on the setup, you can define that and then have access to. So instead of doing this, you say on the setup, which is a function, setup, here you can define now this like the normal JavaScript here. So unlike data, on the setup function, you are now in the free land of JavaScript. It means that you can say, hey, message here. You don't need to you need to return, okay. Hey, message here. This is a reactive reference that initially it will say something like that. I don't remember what it is. View with ES models, okay. This is view with ES model, and then I'm going to return the message here. And this will work as expected. Okay. The import map tells the browser to tell the browser that if it finds a view import, fetch that resource based on the import map script. Okay. So all of this is quite useful because if you can imagine that if you have now a PHP server, a Python, a Ruby server, Node.js, you want to now construct that HTML documents in that server, fetch that data with any query method that you go, whether it's an MVC, whatever, right? You fetch that data, then you populate that data here, okay? And then you're going to construct now the final document that is ready to be sent. And this is the form of this. That makes a lot of sense. And it's actually interesting. And it's also interesting. Okay. Cannot find that? What? Oh, because I moved them? That's right, I moved them. Because it's this one. And the other is this one. Interesting. So if we take a look now on the inspect here, all right, you're running the development build on view. I think they will tell me that in both cases. The development build, okay. View global, and the other is the view ES browser. All right. Okay. Cool. Cool. Git remote. Get URL. No such remote origin found. Okay. No problema, bro. Okay. Good, good, good. And here we are. There you go. Oh, let's going to ignore that. DS store. Okay. All right. There you go. Okay, cool, cool. Cool, 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 cool. Next one.
Just based on this, for those who have been working with web apps for a while, you might already start to realize there's a lot of flexibility with this. Because now all of a sudden, if you have a backend that's not quite ready to integrate all the build tools and everything to get it up and running, you can just on a specific page, when you're proposing to start progressively migrating your apps, you can say on this page, we're going to drop the CDN, and we're going to like add the basically interactivity to this page, and over time, we'll migrate away, and then once we have enough pages that consolidate that view, then we can actually invest the time to do the build tools. Because I think a lot of times when we think about migration, a lot of times developers are thinking like, code freeze everything, no new features, and we just stop development. And we know that practically speaking, that just rarely works for business. And so this is a really great way for us to basically go ahead and migrate an enterprise app over to something that needs to be more modern framework environment. Now that said, we have a message here. Now what if we wanted to, let's say, show or hide it based on whether or not the message is even? Well, something that Vue is also known for are their directives. And so for those who have come from Angular, this might look a little familiar. So the way that it works is that we basically would have a normal HTML element. So let's wrap this in a p element. And then this one we're going to say even. And this one we're going to say odd. Okay? And so the idea here being that what we'd like to do is if the message.length is even, show the even keyword, otherwise show the odd keyword. And so one way we can do this is we can use something called Vue directives. And the way it works is it's basically an attribute you add on an HTML element, and it's prefixed with v dash. So in this case, if I go v dash if equals message.length, and I'll use the modulus 2 with 0 to determine that it's even. And then otherwise, v else, it'll display the other thing. So if we refresh this, we'll see, okay, there we go. We'll notice that it is currently odd. And so now if I delete the exclamation mark, that should bring us over to even. And so what we see here is, again, one of the things I talked about when it came to Vue is that it builds on top of what you already know. And so when most people are working with HTML and CSS, there's a lot of value in extending upon people's existing knowledge when it comes to extending APIs. And so in this regard, by basically having the convention of the v dash, and then using the like if-else statements, again, if you know JavaScript, in fact, you don't even need to know JavaScript. People would actually understand this property, granted, maybe not this part, but when people are navigating HTML, they would actually understand what's going on here, rather than if you had kind of big if-else blocks that have a bunch of functions in it, which again, I think sometimes we find is a little bit tricky with
interpolation.
Those can be harder to follow, especially if you don't have as much experience with JavaScript. But this here keeps basically a semantic, concise way of telling people what's going on. Now, the other directive that I want to talk about is this one. But before we do that, here's a slide to talk about this. And this is from a while ago from Sansacone. And what it says here is that 99.7% of software development in one requirement. A user should be able to view a list of items. And I still think that's incredibly relevant today, right? That's what we're doing half the time. We're taking a bunch of data, rendering out a list. And I don't know about you all, but when I was doing this in React originally, I realized there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I know that there's more of a best practice now, but that can be confusing for users, especially if they have a function that runs the map, or maybe in this case, use the for loop. There's a lot of kind of deciding what to do. And so let's go ahead and show how rendering a list works in Vue. So in this case, I'm just going to do a list of numbers here, just to keep it easy. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we have an array here. And then what we're going to do here is we're just going to do an unordered list. And then what are we trying to repeat, right? We're trying to repeat the list item. So what we're going to have is, as you might want to guess, is that we have the v4 directive. right? Using the for loop concept from JavaScript. And what are we looping for? For every number in list of numbers, we're going to go ahead and just put the number in. That's it. And if you refresh, there you go. Done. Your list is rendered. It's fantastic. And so what's really nice about this, once again, is that we are trying to extend upon people's base knowledge of JavaScript without getting too much in the weeds. Again, the syntax is written in a way that's approachable for people to, sort of like in plain English, really. For number in list of numbers, print number. Great, I understand what that means, even if I don't know JavaScript. The other fun fact about the declarative rendering of the curly braces here is that it's not meant to just print out variables. It actually does evaluate JavaScript statements. So if in the case of, let's say we wanted to like be really excited about the fact that it's even, we can actually
It's because it's text interpolation.
And run it. And then you'll see that it'll actually transform the
Is
text
interpreted into JavaScript.
So theoretically, you could also do things like, well, let's just multiply like math.random in here. And we refresh this, boom. I mean, please. We have some interesting numbers up here. But that's something to consider. Now,
using
the thing about
JavaScript
this is when we
expression.
discover this, sometimes they get really carried away. And we're talking like ternary statements and ternary statements. And that to me is very, I would say, anti-view ethos in that we're trying to make it easy for people to understand interpreters, right? So I would say when it comes to basically inlining your JavaScript inside of these double curly braces,
In the attribute value and any view directory specified.
as much as humanly possible. So the question we have here is in regard to the differences between the view 2-way and the view 3-way. So the view 3-way, as we see here, is that you can abstract a helper function from view, or if for those familiar with the view 2-way, we had view, it was new view. You would instantiate a new view at this way.
Expressions
And so
only.
part of the reason this approach has changed is
Each
because
binding can contain one single
modular and
expression.
performant. In other words, being able to
An
split
expression is a piece of
apart.
code that can be
With
evaluated
this
to a
sort of
value.
view approach, basically you have everything instantiated with it, and it was a lot harder from like a bundling perspective. Like think of it from a library maintenance perspective. That was a lot of the motivation behind this new approach, which you'll see a lot.
No, it's
more
only
in the
expressions,
is that there's a lot of helper functions, which we'll actually see
not a
in the
statement.
workshop, that allow you to basically break apart pieces of view that are helpful in certain instances, and otherwise it'll know to either drop certain things and optimize itself. So the question here is around the idea of the v4 element being like basically someone having the impression that they thought that they would put it on the ul element. But the reason why this is not the case is because we have to think through what exactly we want the renderer to be looping through, right? What is the element we're repeating? And in this case, we're repeating the list in this regard, and not say like we don't want the entire unordered list. So for example, if we did this, so we can do it like this. If we refresh it, you'll notice that at first glance it kind of looks the same, but when we take a look underneath, you'll see that there are individual unordered lists happening in this case. So don't get me wrong, if in the case you have a bunch of, like, okay, let's just actually give that example. If in the case we have different things that were going on in each element, so let's say that, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have like an object here, and let's say like name, then ID, let's just okay, so here we have a more complex data set, right? We have a bunch of objects in each. So if I refresh this now, you might notice that, well, nothing.
Yep.
Oh, I am doing that. Okay, that totally makes sense. All right. Okay, here we go. So now if I save this.
But no, it can render.
So in this particular case, maybe then
It can render expressions.
Sublist. So I realized I actually didn't have the other.
Unlike React, it cannot render objects.
Here we had another list inside of here that would then 1, 2, 3, for example. Then we might say, for example, in this particular list, we want the first item to show the ID, so we say number.id, and then we could then embed a second list, and that's where we would do it loop through number.list like this. So instead of number, I'm going to say switch this to item, because now this is more accurate, and then number in number list. Refresh this.
It's not gonna work. It's because it is item. Item list right below there.
Oh yes, ha, good catch. Okay, there we go. And so that's an example where you might want to loop, possibly. Although at that point you might even be a div and kind of be wondering why you'd want just the one. But basically consider how you want the semantic HTML to be rendered out. Quick note for the next question. In case anyone was wondering how I sort of did the data population, that is the text pastry VS Code extension. That's highly underutilized, but it's really great at generating things on the fly as far as ranges, and also like custom UI, which is great for random data when you're doing some sandbox coding like I did. Next question. So the question here is around this particular keyword data here. In this particular context, when you're passing a configuration object to create app, this is basically a reserved keyword in that it is called data and that's what it has to be. However, I will tell you right now that if you're more of a fan of calling it state, there's going to be another style of component that we'll be covering.
Yeah, but we're talking about here is now at the this is the template syntax, right?
That will allow you to basically name things as you see fit. But
And yeah, and the naming syntax here is to say, hey, you can render expressions, not statements, which is different, all right? And expressions are what is the difference between expression? Okay. Expressions produce a value, and a statement performs an action. That's the difference between them. That's the difference between them. Okay. So an expression produces a value, and a statement is an action, or performs an action. Interesting. Okay. Okay. Cool. So expressions only. In other words, things that produce a value. So calling functions here, like this, right? And this is how you can pass this. Restricted global access and directive like vif, vbinds, and this is a shorthand, and dynamic arguments, and so on and so forth.
And so what we'll be doing today as far as for basically going forward for the rest of the workshop, you can find all the different snapshots of where we start and stop inside the individual branches. And so basically O1 begin, let me go ahead and add everything. So check, take status, we change the playground. And so check it. So this is the way that's going to work. And basically use the int if to open up index if for whatever reason you have the avatar parent. So the text element will say, hey, no characters, and then it populates it and spells it out. And then, okay, so a data function. Now I'm going to show you a new syntax that I personally prefer to use, which is that I'll use the arrow function for basically assigning a function to data, and then I'll wrap the object in the parentheses. So it basically saves a couple lines of code. So just to show the difference on that real quick. You'll see here, this is data, parentheses, then the actual explicit return. This has the implicit return with the arrow, and then we just define it. So here I can do the characters like this, and I'll go ahead and wrap this now. Column. Okay. So then we'll have 4 objects. So actually, no, I'm going to go ahead and do this. This is an object of the character. So the way we do that is the playground. So every character, very common in programming, and I find that happens a lot with spelling too. And so the 1s plural has caught me multiple times. So personally, I usually like to just say that it's a list. It's a little bit longer, but then you just have that visual distinction. It's character and character list. Then I can just render out character name, which is great. Although, what's happening here? Why isn't it working? This is a common mistake that we often make when we're sort of creating the app this way, is because what we have to remember to do is we need to tell Vue where we need to mount it. So we're going to go ahead and run the mount command on this. I'm going to mount it to the ID app. And once we do that, save, refresh. Warn selector. Why is that? Well, typos. Didn't I say something about one-off errors right here? This is one that'll catch you off guard because in your mind you're thinking CSS selector, but you don't need the extra hashtags. Hey, there we go, everything's working. So now all we got to do though is complete the exercise by saying if character list length is equal to 0, then show that. Otherwise, show this. Okay, as you can see, boom, there we go, it's working. If we go ahead and just go ahead and update that real quick, you'll see there are no characters shown. Now, something worth noting about the vif directive though is that when you use the vif directive, what Vue is actually doing is, let me take a look, is that the UL that you have here for the else condition does not even exist anymore. So basically the elements are being destroyed and recreated each time. So as you can see here now, if we take a look at the app.
Exactly, all of the elements are created and destroyed.
And so this is contrary to another directive that you will see in Vue called v-show, which is, I'll say, its less popular cousin. And that's because what v-show does is it toggles the visibility of the element via CSS. And so the reason you want those two different approaches is because there are times where it might be
Yeah, when you need to
performance
performance.
of like destroying a list of thousands of items and then having the DOM recreate it every time someone toggles it on and off. You might just want to show or hide it. So that's where v-show, v-hide can be very useful. So once again, the idea here, building on what we know and trying to make it easy for us to do the right performance optimization. So that's a trade-off to consider when using VS. But again, I would say 95% of the time that is what you want to use. But the moment you start thinking, oh, I'm toggling, users are going to be toggling this a lot, and it might be expensive to destroy it, reach out for VShow.
Do you have an else if in that though? Like a else else?
Yeah, you absolutely can. And so the question here is regarding, can we extend the if-else statement? And absolutely, because when Evan and the team were designing the API for this, their goal really is to extend on what you already know. So if you have if then else, why not else if? So in this particular case, let's just go ahead and for sake, we're going to do the same thing as before. This time character list.length, and then this time we'll just make it even just to kind of showcase this. And then otherwise we'll have p element the else that's right there are characters. So it's even right now, so we add this now and we add another one. Let's do APA, refresh. So we'll run through all the scenarios and then up to the last one. So generally speaking, from a performance perspective, you do probably want to optimize for your most common scenario at the very top, so you don't have view running through everything. But otherwise, yeah, you can else it as long as you as you see fit. Question here. Namespacing the character list. Down here? Oh, okay. So
Oh, the namespace here.
I see. Okay, so I'm going to try to understand. So you're saying that because of the way it's kind of like spelled out, it's kind of confusing. So you want to be explicit about where character list is being called on the parent?
Adding this dot.
Oh, this dot. Okay. We have avoided that up until this point. Something that you'll notice is that we are not actually doing anything special as far as calling the data that's inside of the app, right? We have this character list array, and all we're doing is saying, as we can see here, character list, character. We're basically naming things as we go, and it's because Vue is basically trying to do that step of like abstracting away the things you would normally have to define. So if this were JavaScript, you might have to be like, oh, I have to call the app.data.character list to be like I'm calling character list. But Vue knows that like basically there are conventions in the way you kind of call things. So rather than having you explicitly define everything, it is trying to basically help abstract that away. But in the future, for those who want to be more explicit, there are ways to like namespace that out a little bit. So we'll get into that. Cool. Go for it.
You can almost say that the character list is like global, global to the app.
Yes, at this point, yeah, especially once we start getting into components, because components obviously is a big part of frameworks these days, that will definitely, character list will become, well, hold on. So your question here is regarding whether or not character list becomes global to the entire app. And so it is global to the context in that specific rendering context. So in the case of this page, right, it has the character list, it can show it. When we start getting into components, it will have its own scope, and it will be separate from the parent. So in that regard, you cannot expect character list to just show up in any context. So in Vue, it tries to basically try to optimize for performance. There's a performance impact when it comes to like making things global, but more importantly, you have like namespace polluting that often happens.
Namespace polluting.
From that by forcing you to be explicit with what you want to be shared and what you want to be made global. So there are ways to make global variables in Vue, but I would say most of the time you're probably not doing that. And there are other ways you're trying to share data. So even in the instance of say the use case regarding like the user being logged in, that's something that impacts a lot of different components. And so in the past, the first thing you might be like tempted to do is say, well, I'm just gonna make a global variable that says, hey, is the user logged in? Because I don't know, call it 30% of our code base uses it. But that also means 70% of your code base doesn't use it, and now it has this user logged in state that it has to either worry about or it might conflict for some other reason. And so Vue 3 in particular, especially with the composition API and composables, which I promise we'll cover in this workshop, allows you to then segment that to be very explicit that like on the 30% that care about user logged in, great, drop it in. Otherwise, you don't even have to worry about it. And so we'll definitely be talking about that as well. Does that help to answer your question? Yeah. like we want to render like the list out as like a string.
String commas, but not lines.
Got it. Okay. So the question here is around if you wanted to actually list the string of characters instead. That actually, I would say, okay, there's a couple ways we can do this. With the information we have now, the v-for actually will probably feel a little bit clunky because, let's show this. So let's go ahead and do this. So with the information we have here, if we wanted to have a key element instead that, say, took a span of every character in character list. List, yep, okay, then I'm going to do character.name. Okay, so this should just like give us a mash of strings. Oop, I didn't close it. Save. Okay, boom, right? But what we need is we need that comma space. But you're probably also thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to refresh this now. Okay, that looks better, but to your point, we need the ability to cut off the last part. And so, gosh, I think the way I would do this at first glance would basically be, I would probably just actually do I'm going to just do another inline. Using only the techniques we have right now, I would say we have if character list, or okay. So we want to pull out, okay, here's a great example where we need the index of something, right? And so I'm going to repeat this a lot because I think this is a core thing I'd like to see other APIs continue as well, is that we build on what you already know. And since we're in a for loop in JavaScript, we can actually pull the index out by just pulling out a second argument, because this is the standard JavaScript API. So again, Vue really tries not to like come in and like reinvent things for you. Once you learn it, it's a convention you know, why not use it? So then we can go index is equal to character list dot length minus 1. If that is true, empty string, otherwise comma this. Okay, so again, aha, I can't spell. Fuck that integer. Oh, not a complete piece yet. Length, list. There we go. So there are ways though, if let's say that in your app that you want to go ahead and do like you're constantly stringing stuff together and you want it to always be block, there are ways you can create custom directories. So you can pass it in and it'll do something specific. Most of the time I think what I've seen people do instead is that when we talk about computed properties in a little bit, that's usually something that people use a lot for sort of like computation. So I hope that's your question though. But you're right, I think Angular did have some nice like syntactic sugar for stuff like that. So I would say that absolutely. Okay, so we've learned how to create an app, we've attached some reactive data, that was fun, hopefully pretty easy to do. And now, of course, we want to talk about how we deal with user input, right? Because that's what a lot of JavaScript's value is handling the interactivity of your website. So the first thing we want to talk about is, let's open Playground actually in Chrome. New tab, okay, so for the sake of Playground demo purposes, let's just use the standard example of the counter app, right? Which is the fact that if we go inside of here, and this time I'm going to see this, let's see.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna leave that. That'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.